It has been quite a year in Latin America. There was political instability, tragedy, unexpected triumphs, bizarre twists, and feel-good stories. To see why, join me for this brief look at the highlights of 2023 in Latin America. Political instability was one of the year's themes in the region. It began soon after the presidential inauguration of Lula da Silva in Brazil on January 1st. The incoming president, who had already held the post between 2002 and 2010, returned to the political arena and eked out a victory of less than 2% over Jair Bolsonaro in October 2022. The bitterness of the campaign, the underlying polarization, and the certainty of some of Bolsonaro's supporters that the election was stolen, however, led thousands of them to congregate in Brasilia on January 8th and attack the presidential palace, Supreme Court, and National Congress building. Their intention was to convince the military to carry out a coup to stop the presidential transition. It did not work, but it did take authorities over 5 hours to regain control and expel the rioters, and the attack cost at least $2 million in damages, not to mention the incalculable loss of art and historical artifacts. 2 other countries experienced political unrest in the first weeks of the year. In Bolivia, this was as a result of the arrest of Luis Fernando Camacho, the governor of Santa Cruz and leader of the opposition to the dominant MAS party. He had originally been arrested on December 22, 2022, accused of terrorism and being behind the ouster of President Evo Morales in November 2019. In response, thousands of his supporters marched, and some briefly shut down the Santa Cruz airport, demanding he be freed, continuing their protests into the new year. They were not successful, however. Camacho is still in prison. His trial is scheduled to begin in 2024. In Peru, people were also upset over the imprisonment of a politician, Pedro Castillo, the president of the country, who had tried to illegally shut down Congress on December 7, 2022, in an attempt at a self-coup. In response, Congress impeached him, removed him from office that same day, and put him in jail to await trial. His supporters thought that that was the real coup and exploded into nationwide protests that continued into the new year. These were severely repressed on January 9th, and in Juliaca they had the highest toll when police opened fire on protesters, killing 18 and injuring over 100 more. In Ecuador, a few months later, on May 9th, the Congress began an impeachment process against President Guillermo Lasso, who was accused of being part of an illegal campaign financing scheme, a scandal that became known as El Gran Padrino. The Ecuadorian Assembly looked like they would be successful in removing Lasso from office, until, on May 17th, the president employed a legislative tactic called Muerte Cruzada, roughly translated as mutual death, so named because it is basically a way to call for new elections of both the president and the Congress, but only to finish out their term. In the end, Lasso decided not to face the voters again, and Daniel Noboa was elected on October 15. The new election, however, was overshadowed by the tragic assassination of one of the candidates, Fernando Villavicencio, who was shot as he was leaving a campaign rally on August 9th. Authorities immediately blamed organized crime and declared a state of emergency. In Guatemala, political instability would manifest itself a bit differently. The government, especially its Attorney General, Maria Consuelo Porras, had been systematically disallowing some of the more popular candidates. But on August 20th, a candidate that previously had little chance of winning, Bernardo Arévalo, beat Sandra Torres by over 20 points. Despite the huge margin, Torres argued fraud, and subsequently there was an effort to suspend Semilla, Arévalo's political party, although the Electoral Tribunal reversed that on September 3rd. Then, 9 days later, September 12, the Attorney General raided the offices of the Supreme Electoral Tribunal and opened the electoral boxes that contained ballots, which according to them was an effort to investigate electoral irregularities. This brought on a political crisis, and on October 9th, there were massive national protests that demanded the Attorney General resign. Even that did not stop the efforts to prevent Arévalo from taking office in 2024. And on December 8th, one of the prosecutors said that he had new evidence of fraud and called for the elections to be declared null and void and to be annulled. On December 14th, the Constitutional Court finally declared that Arévalo's transition should be guaranteed, which as of right now seems like the final word. In Panama, social unrest exploded over the renewal of a mining contract for an open copper mine on October 20th. People were upset because of its location in the Donoso district, an area full of biodiversity, which would invariably see environmental damage. Protests would continue until the Panamanian Supreme Court declared the law that permitted its renewal to be unconstitutional on November 28th, which led to the definitive closing of the mine. In Haiti, the erosion of government power continued as gangs expanded their control over the country. On March 21st, the UN reported that 531 people had been killed since the beginning of the year as a result of clashes between gangs, and on November 16th, Kenya approved the deployment of its police officers to Haiti as part of a United Nations-backed multinational security mission to bring order to the country. In Argentina, there was no massive social unrest or constitutional crisis, but rather economic mismanagement that resulted in a simmering inflation problem and public discontent. This in turn led to the shocking election on October 22nd of Javier Milei, a previously obscure legislator and self-described anarcho-capitalist, whose main proposals were to dollarize the economy and to do away with much of the bureaucratic apparatus of the Argentine state, given its waste. In his speech upon taking office on December 10th, he announced massive cuts, a devaluation of 50% of the Argentine peso, and the promise that for a few months Argentina would be worse than before until the painful medicine got it back on track. There were 3 other elections of note in Latin America this year that were held without experiencing political instability or social unrest. The first took place on April 30th when Paraguayans went to the polls to choose their president and picked Santiago Peña, a member of the ruling Colorado Party. This victory broke a streak of 15 consecutive victories for the opposition in Latin America, although this had to do more with Paraguay's internal dynamics rather than happiness with the job of the previous president, Mario Abdo Benitez. The second happened on October 22nd in Venezuela, when the opposition held a primary to choose the candidate that would face Maduro next year, the first since 2012. Turnout reached over 2 million votes despite significant obstacles, no less from the government, giving hope to the opposition for 2024. A big problem, however, is that the person they chose was Maria Corina Machado, an individual that has been officially barred from running for office by the Maduro government. Something that happened precisely because of her popularity, although of course that is not the official reason. The US government had negotiated easing some of the sanctions in exchange for free and fair elections, so it is not clear whether Machado will be allowed to run or not. And the last one took place in Chile on December 17th. This was a referendum on a proposed new constitution, itself the result of negotiations after a previous constitutional proposal was rejected in 2022 over complaints that it was too left-wing. As it turns out, the 2023 proposed constitution ended up also being rejected, this time over complaints that it was too right-wing. And thus, Chile will retain the constitution originally drafted by Pinochet's government in 1980, quite a change from expectations in October 2020 when voters overwhelmingly voted to approve the drafting of a new constitution. Another one of this year's themes in the region was migration and borders. Desperation continued to send migrants north, sometimes with awful consequences. On March 28th, at a migrant detention center in Ciudad Juárez, a tragedy unfolded after a fire broke out. According to the Mexican government, a number of migrants started the fire to protest the poor conditions of the center and their pending deportation. Whether that is true or not, what made it tragic was that those in charge fled from the building but left the detainees locked in their cell. As a result, 40 people died and 27 were seriously injured. Meanwhile, on September 11th, the Dominican Republic closed its border with Haiti and suspended visas for Haitians over the use of water in the Rio Masacre. It would remain completely closed for over 30 days. Later that month, on September 26th, Costa Rica declared an emergency as a result of the migrant surge that has been trekking through the Darien Gap on the way to the US-Mexico border. And on December 3rd, Venezuela held a referendum over the country's claims of the Essequibo, an area controlled by Guyana, and a territorial dispute that has lasted centuries. Analysts saw the move largely as a way for the unpopular Maduro regime in Venezuela to try to bolster its national credentials ahead of a potential 2024 election. The referendum passed, but the turnout was poor. Nonetheless, it exacerbated tensions between Guyana and Venezuela, and after international pressure, especially from Brazil, the two countries agreed on December 14th to have dialogue over the issue. Another unfortunate theme in Latin America this year were all the natural disasters exacerbated by climate change. Argentina began the year with a massive heat wave that had begun the previous November and costed billions of dollars in lost harvests. Parts of Uruguay, Paraguay, and Brazil also felt it, but the latter felt a much worse one in November 2023 when Brazilians experienced several consecutive days of over 43 degrees Celsius or 190 degrees Fahrenheit. As a result, on November 17th at a Taylor Swift concert in Rio, the extreme weather conditions coupled with bad concert management led to around 1,000 people fainting inside the stadium and one person dying due to cardiac arrest, probably brought on by dehydration. Uruguay, meanwhile, also had water problems, but on a much more massive scale. The heat waves and subsequent drought nearly emptied the country's entire water reservoirs, forcing the government to impose emergency measures in June to meter the remaining water. This would go on until August 23rd, when Uruguay officially declared an end to the crisis. Water problems were not limited to droughts. In February, Brazil faced so much rain that it brought floods and landslides to the coastal area of Sao Paulo, an increasingly common occurrence in the country. Fortunately, the death toll was much smaller than similar instances in the last few years. The region's most destructive natural event this year, however, did not happen in South America but in Mexico. On October 25th, a Category 5 storm, Hurricane Otis, struck Acapulco, one of the country's most important tourist destinations. The powerful winds absolutely devastated the city, damaging over 80% of the hotels in the area and killing at least 52 people, with local estimates in the hundreds. It also caused around $17 billion in damage, a hole that Acapulco will be in for quite a while. Fortunately, not all events of note were about the weakness of governments or the immense challenges they face. On January 5th, Mexico captured the son of El Chapo Guzman, Ovidio, one of the more powerful drug traffickers in the country, who would then be extradited to the US in September. And on December 2nd, Honduras arrested Daniela Tala, the mastermind behind the assassination of Berta Cáceres, an activist that was gunned down in her home in March 2016 in retaliation for leading a campaign to stop construction of an internationally financed hydroelectric dam. Cáceres had won several international prizes prior to her assassination and had gained notoriety, particularly as an indigenous leader and environmental defender, subsequently becoming a symbol for those who want to protect the environment from moneyed interests. The region also had some genuinely feel-good stories. The first one came on January 20th when the Colombian Navy saved a man from the island of Dominica, Elvis Francois, who accidentally came adrift in the Caribbean and survived on a leaky boat for 24 days until he came close to the South American mainland. The second came on March 22nd when Luis Caffarelli, an Argentine considered to be one of the most important scientists his country has ever produced, won the Abel Prize in Mathematics, an award equivalent to the Nobel Prize. Then in July, Brazil announced that it had cut the rate of Amazonian deforestation by 34%, an important number given changes in global warming. Meanwhile, Nicaragua got some rare good news when on November 18th, the representative at the Miss Universe pageant, Shanice Palacios, won the whole thing, a first for the country. But probably the feel-good story of the year came from a miracle in Colombia, although it began as a tragedy. On May 1st, a domestic flight to San José del Guaviare accidentally crashed in the jungle. There were 7 people on board, including a mother and 4 children. The pilot and another adult died on impact, and the mother died 4 days later, leaving the children, whose ages spanned from 13 to a little less than a year, to fend for themselves in the rainforest. Somehow, they survived for 40 days in the jungle before being rescued by the Colombian military and volunteers from local indigenous groups. According to them, the children were malnourished, but otherwise had no health issues. Meanwhile, in sports, there were a number of good feel stories for the region. In the World Baseball Classic, Mexico and Cuba made it to the semifinals on March 19th and 20th, a first for Mexico and only a second for Cuba, something that was much celebrated. Unfortunately for them, they lost to Japan and the US respectively. Likewise, in May, the Under-20 FIFA World Cup was held in Argentina, a bittersweet addition for the hosts because they lost early in the round of 16, but a triumph for Uruguay, who beat Italy in the final to win their first title in 23 editions. Another pleasing performance for the region was the Colombian women's soccer team, as they reached the World Cup's quarterfinals, their furthest ever, and only Latin American team to make it to the knockout stage. It even looked like they had a good chance of getting to the semifinals when they went up 1-0 on the 44th minute. Unfortunately for them, England turned it around and they ended up losing 2-1. This year's main sporting event in the region took place in Chile when on October 20th the Pan American Games were inaugurated in Santiago, the first time they were held there. Chile was able to win its most combined medals ever with 79, while Brazil and Mexico both had their most successful performance of all time, winning 66 golds and 55 respectively. Still, probably the most watched sporting event came on November 4th, the day of the final of the Copa Libertadores, the highest international competition for soccer clubs in South America. In that match, Fluminense beat Boca Juniors to win their first title. Amazingly, Boca Juniors had gotten to the last stage while scoring only 2 goals in 6 games, relying on penalty kicks to advance. It seemed like that might happen yet again when they tied 1-1 and went into extra time. This time, Fluminense took care of business with a goal in the 99th minute. It was just enough. Meanwhile, 2023 also had its share of bizarre stories. The 2 most notorious ones came from Mexico. First, in December 2022, there were allegations that a Supreme Court Justice, Yasmín Esquivel, had plagiarized a thesis for her bachelor's degree. Then, on January 11th, the university that granted her degree, UNAM, confirmed that indeed she had substantively copied someone else's thesis but could not take her degree away. And on February 24th, the Spanish newspaper El País showed that she had also plagiarized the thesis for her doctorate. Throughout, Esquivel denied any wrongdoing despite the obvious proof, refused to resign, and waited until the scandal died down, which it eventually did. The most bizarre event of all, however, occurred on September 12th in Mexico City when at a congressional hearing on UFOs, Jaime Maussan unveiled what he claimed were alien corpses that were found in a mine in Peru near Nazca. The Peruvian government immediately called it a hoax, as did many others, including in the Mexican Congress itself, but social media had a blast. One final thing to note is the number of important Latin Americans who said their final goodbye this year. May they rest in peace. And may all of you remember 2023 fondly and have an even better 2024. Happy New Year!